What's up, everybody? Welcome to my channel, Dancing with Ghosts. I'm trying out a little something different tonight, something more, well, quite frankly, easier for me to execute than setting up my entire recording rig to do a video. So I'm just going to do a more laid-back kind of tier review here of ranking every Genesis album. Prog rock band Genesis, one of my favorite bands of all time. I'm going to do the S through D tier. Still not exactly sure what the letters stand for. I'm going to assume it's similar to when you're in school. S is like, I guess, satisfactory. A is amazing. B is, pretty good. C is and D just sucks. So anyway, I'm just going to go through here and get started. So the first Genesis album we have is from Genesis to Revelation. Now, I'm going to put this in the D category because this was not a proper Genesis album. Phil Collins wasn't in the band. A lot of the members who are in that incarnation of Genesis did not even make it to the next album, Trespass. Ostensibly, at this point, Genesis were a pop act trying to make it in the pop world, so this album was just not at all reflective of anything that would come to be what we know as, one of the gods of prog rock. Their next album, Trespass, I'm going to put that, for me personally, I'm going to put that at a B tier, because even though to a lot of people this is essential Genesis, to me this is not exactly my favorite period of them yet. They're still very early in their career and in their sound. And the music, to me, though there's some good songs on here, it sounds very dated. It sounds a little corny, Visions of Angels, and what you got? I think Tony Banks is singing on that one. The Knife is the big fan favorite from that album. That's the last track, although I like Looking for Someone, the first track, pretty good. Looking for someone, I guess I'm doing that. Yeah, it's a cool song, but Not a great album as far as I'm concerned. Then we move on to Nursery Crime, Genesis' second album. I'm going to also put that in the B tier for me personally, because for many of the reasons of the first album, they're still in their infancy as far as their experimentation, although we do start seeing songs like The Musical Box, which performed live turns out to be one of their most powerful songs that they do live, especially when that organ comes in at the end and Peter's doing, I've been waiting here for so long and all this time has passed me by. Anyway, you know what I'm talking about. It sounds even more, in my opinion, it sounds more badass when Phil Collins sings it whenever they do their whole song medley live at that point. And then you had the more slow burn for Absent Friends, which is your typical Genesis 12-string ballad. Return of Giant Hogweed is a really badass song, really cool guitar, kind of keyboard, triplet intro. Herald of the Barrel, kind of a silly song, and then you get more typical 70s fair progginess after that. So next we have Foxtrot. I've got to put that in the A tier. I think any Genesis fan might kill me if that didn't make it into the A tier. We have Watcher of the Skies. Need I say more? That's a fantastic opening song to an album. Fantastic opening song for their live shows. They open their live shows all the time with those haunting mellotron chords for Watcher of the Skies. So that's a great track. And Get 'Em Out by Friday is a cool song, very cool. Horizons is actually an instrumental played by Steve Hackett right before the mega daddy that put Genesis on the map, Supper's Ready. It clocks in at what is it, 17, 18 minutes long? It's a very long track, but it's amazing. Supper's Ready is such an amazing song. The only complaint I guess I would have about Supper's Ready is that you almost wish that it was separated into individual movements, if you will. And I feel like it probably would have been a more popular album, because you could have had radio cuts at that point, because songs or movements on there, like Willow Farm, Apocalypse and 9/8. Well, maybe not Apocalypse and 9/8, but anyway, there's certain movements in that overall song that totally could have been radio hits. So next we get to Selling England by the Pound. That is obviously S tier, top of the line Genesis. They are reaching the culmination of their progginess and their more shorter sensibility. Their songs are sounding more timeless at this point. The opening track, Dancing with the Moonlit Night, has some of the most tasty kind of guitar licks in there. These big mellotron choirs with Phil Collins just really adding that drum groove. Peter Gabriel at the top of his game with the melody game and the lyrics. And then right after that, you have I Know What I Like in Your Wardrobe, which is kind of Genesis' attempt at that time to do a pop song. Firth of Fifth, which has one of my favorite, besides the guitar solo from Pink Floyd's Comfortably Numb, Firth of Fifth has my second favorite guitar solo of all time in it. Go and listen to that song and listen to the middle part where the guitar comes in and then it builds and the mellotron comes in, and it's just amazing. Everything after that album, I mean, those are three huge songs, but honestly, after that, it kind of goes down a little bit for me. Some Genesis fans really like the Cinema Show. I could, it's okay, but it doesn't really stick out. Up next, we have The Lamb Lies Down Broadway. S tier, possibly Genesis' best album, definitely their best Gabriel era album. This was a double album concept that Peter Gabriel came up with lyrically. Now, some will say that this album has suffered because Peter took the majority of the lyric writing, or all of the lyric writing. He really wanted it to lyrically be one cohesive, linear path, and he felt like if he shared the lyric writing with other band members, that goal would not have been achieved. So he took it upon himself to do all the lyric writing. So it made it difficult to break songs down into singles that could be played on the radio, and as a result, this album didn't sell all that well at the time, although it's gone on to become a huge cult classic with the fans. But, I mean, geez, you got Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, Fly on a Windshield, which is one of the heaviest and most melodic. I mean, you hear this song and you're like, this song was from 1975. It sounds like some epic, like this whole caravan of warriors being led into Egypt when this song breaks in with these huge mellotron synth lines and this guitar just doing this really soaring lead over it. I mean, there is like really no bad song in this album, and this is a double album. You know how hard it is to make a good double album that keeps your interest and is worth being a double album? Cuckoo Cocoon, some really cool guitar work in there by Steve Hackett. In the Cage, an amazing epic of musical proportions. The Grand Parade of Lifeless Packaging. They use Brian Eno's vocal voice ring modulator to mess up Peter Gabriel's vocals in that particular song. Back in New York City, that song's been covered by a lot of bands. Very heavy, cool guitar riff. Hairless Heart. Counting Out Time, which was going to be their single, or the record company wanted it to be their single, but it never took. Carpet Crawlers, which has obviously become a huge live staple for any Genesis show. Chamber 32 Doors, the last track on the first side, or the first album. That song, you really hear Peter Gabriel's singing style fully blossom into the soul singer that he will become later on in pop music. Chamber 32 Doors, give it a listen. You will see the Peter that we will all come to know and love later in his career starts sprouting in that song. Anyway, I could go on about this album, but probably one of my favorite songs is The Lamia and The Light Dies Down on Broadway. Those are just two amazing songs. I fucking love that album so much. Moving on, we have A Trick of the Tail, another S tier for me. This is another one of Genesis' best albums, in my opinion. We have the advent of Phil Collins going from behind the drum set to in front of the mic. His melodies are fantastic. His voice, still not at the Phil Collins that we all know and love from more of their 80s efforts, but it's got that young exuberance that kind of makes up for his polish that he would get on later albums. The songs are just amazing. You have the opener, Dance on a Volcano, such a powerful guitar lick. Again, these songs, because of Tony Banks' very ingenuitive keyboard playing and writing, these albums age so much better than most albums of the 70s. The next song, Entangled, one of the most beautiful 12-string Genesis ballads ever. I mean, you would think you're listening to this Crosby, Stills, and Nash song on crack. It's amazing. Squonk, the song after, this very synth-driven kind of rockin' song with Phil Collins' very, very raw vocal. Then you have Madman Moon, which is Tony Banks' big kind of ballad, saga, great song. I'd say Robbery, Assault, and Battery is by far the weakest song on this album. I would have much rather them had replaced that song with a different song, because that song kind of sucks. But anyway, Ripples, beautiful song, Trick of the Tail, and Los Endos is one of the coolest Genesis songs of all time. They played it all the time live. I highly recommend listening to Los Endos, the last track on Trick of the Tail. Moving on, we get to Wind and Wuthering. I'm going to have to put this at a C level. After Trick of the Tail, a lot of the band members in Genesis went on and did their own solo albums, did their own kind of solo material. As a result, when they all came back to the Wind and Wuthering sessions to follow up from their successful departure of Gabriel, they were all drive material, except for Tony Banks, a keyboard player. That's why this is a very keyboard, piano-heavy album. Tony Banks has even been quoted himself by saying this was more of a romantic album, and I feel as a result of that, there's a lot of not watered down, because I don't think anything Genesis does is watered down, but it feels more like a Tony Banks solo album than anything else, although I will say that Blood on the Rooftops is a great song. Unique Slumbers for Sleepers in That Quiet Earth is a really great kind of traditional Genesis instrumental jam. But everything else on this album, I could take it or leave it, including Afterglow. I'm not the biggest fan of that song, even though it's kind of become a fan favorite live. Up next, we have And Then There Were Three. That is definitely going to be a B tier for me. Very good album, but it feels like we're in the middle of a Genesis evolutionary phase in their career. Starting off with the first song, Down and Out, got a really very drum-heavy, groove-heavy, very frantic, high-tempo song. Great way to open the album. They're definitely wanting to distance themselves from the previous album where it was slower and more romantic, as Tony Banks would put it. And then you had, although you still had some very piano-y stuff in here, like Undertow and Snowbound and Many Too Many, although these are great songs. Deep in the Motherlode is a great song, probably one of the most underrated Genesis songs of all time, and the best song on this album, in my opinion, is Scenes from a Night's Dream. That has such a groove, is such a cool middle section. Definitely recommend giving this album a listen. Fun fact, this was the first album where Genesis had a #1 hit song with Follow You, Follow Me, written by Mike Rutherford, and can be heard in pharmacies and dentist offices around the world now. Up next, we have Genesis follow-up to that album, Duke. Oh, this is hard. I'm going to have to put Duke in the A category. Duke really sees Genesis come into the next century in this album, as far as just the quality of the writing. There's definitely a lot more pop sensibility. I think they got a taste for that pop success from their last album, the one song off their last album, and I guess they tried to kind of replicate it. All the songs are shorter now. Phil Collins has even said of this album that this was when he really felt like he stepped into his own as a singer, and you can hear as much on the song Guide Vocal. I mean, really the whole album is Phil Collins just really becoming a singer, really reaping the benefits of touring all those years, being the frontman of Genesis at that point. He had a few albums under his belt. Behind the Lines, the opening track on this album, would later be recycled by Phil and sped up and funkified for his first debut album, Face Value. So that's kind of interesting that he recycled a song that was already on a previous Genesis album. Another fun fact, In the Air Tonight was a song that Phil wrote to be put on this album. In the Air Tonight, the famous Phil Collins' biggest song by far, was almost put on this album, Duke. But Keyboardist Tony Banks swears up and down that Phil had never played In the Air Tonight for him, and Phil swears up and down that he did play the song for Tony, and it was rejected. So anyway, you have great songs on here. Duchess has this it's very synth heavy, very kind of slow, vibey track. Turn It On Again, a song that's in 5/4 time. It sounds catchy, it sounds dancey, but try to keep the beat, and it's always a beat longer than what you expect, and it throws you off. And that's the beauty of prog rock and the beauty of Genesis being able to slide that prog sensibility into such a poppy sounding song. Up next on the tier list, we have Abacab, which I've got to put for me in where I'm at with the band. That's got to go in the S tier, because I love the synth heaviness. I loved how they started doing the gated reverb on the drums for this album. The drums got hairier, they got fatter. They had that room sound. The synths had this fat, hairy kind of room sound to it. The bass was this throbbing, very kind of, the instrument that had character to it. Unlike the last, few albums, the bass kind of wasn't in the forefront as much. Steve Hackett had been gone at this point. He had left the previous album. He had departed from the band, but by this album... actually, no, it was 2 albums ago. My apologies, because he left and then there were 3. But you really get the sense that Phil, Tony, and Mike, the 3 remaining members of Genesis, had really come into their own at this point as far as being able to write as a trio and write well, because they definitely had some hit songs off of this album, such as Abacab, No Reply at All, Man on the Corner. One of my favorite Genesis songs is Keep It Dark. That's another thing. They were getting into like a pop world with this album, but the weirdness was all over it. Listen to Keep It Dark. It sounds like it should be a traditional pop song, but it's got these weird little elements in it that make it just a little left of center, and I love that about Genesis. Moving on, we have their self-titled album, Genesis. Now, I hate to say this, but I have to put this in the A tier for me, because even though this album has my favorite song that Genesis has ever done on it, Mama, there are just some tracks on here that just kill it for me. Illegal Alien is the most hated Genesis song in any Genesis fan community. That song is so goofy. Phil Collins is doing an awful Mexican, I guess, accent or affectation to his singing. The music video was super cringy, with everyone wearing Mexican mustaches and sombreros, and it's no fun being an illegal alien. It was so corny, but Phil had success at that point with his album Face Value, so I bet he felt he had more pull. I guarantee you, if he had not had a hit album, Tony and Mike would have fucking 86'd Illegal Alien from making it onto this record. But you have Mama. Fuck, what an amazing experimental pop masterpiece of a song that is. That's All. Pretty good song. This album is where you start kind of hearing a lot more Phil influence. You were hearing a lot of it in Abacab with the horns on No Reply at All, but in this one, the songs aren't as serious. There's songs like, obviously Illegal Alien, but then you got Just a Job to Do. I don't know. There's some good songs on here. Home by the Sea, Second Home by the Sea, but then I guess the side B is where this album really loses me. Illegal Alien, Taking It All Too Hard, which is a good song, but it sounds more Phil solo album than it does anything else. Just a Job to Do is okay. Silver Rainbow's pretty good. It's Gonna Get Better, pretty good. Again, starting to feel more like a Phil Collins solo album, so that's why it gets the B or the A tier. I'm going to put that in the B tier. I'm changing my mind. Thinking about Illegal Alien just gets it knocked to the B tier. Up next, we have Invisible Touch. I'm going to go ahead and put this in the A tier. Obviously, this is their most poppy album and their most commercially successful album. So, I'm going to put it there. Obviously, I heard a lot of songs off that album that I love, like Tonight, 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 and Land of Confusion. But then you got songs on the album that kind of pull it down, like Anything She Does is kind of a weak song, and they never play that one live. I don't know why that is. I'm sure I could easily probably look it up and find out, but that's like the one song off the album they've never done live, and it's really not that great of a song, so I don't blame them for not doing that song live. Invisible Touch is an 80s pop song through and through with no weirdness whatsoever. This is pure Phil Collins pop, 80s pop. There's nothing weird about that song. Land of Confusion is a badass track, very cool guitar stuff, very cool synth stuff, does sound very 80s. They're starting to date their material on this album by making it, adding in more and more components of the time period that it's set in. That's the only thing that concerns me about this album. In Too Deep is a straight up Phil Collins ballad. At this point, he gets what he wants because he's had like 2 or 3 successful solo albums at this point. Domino Parts 1 and 2, they're trying to go back to their prog rock roots and do a long song. I don't know. It sounds all right. A lot of the sounds on that on that song sound very cheap to me. Tony Banks' synthesizers are starting to sound cheaper and cheaper as their albums go on. It culminates in this album. There's a lot of very cheap sounds on this album, but they were new at the time, and god damn it, people are going to use them. Throwing It All Away, I'm just so sick of that song. It's like one of those songs you hear on the radio a few times, and it's like, okay, enough already with this song. I'm good. And it's just a sappy kind of breakup song. And then it ends on The Brazilian, which is an instrumental, and it's kind of I don't know, it's okay, but they had a track they left off this album called Do the Neurotic, which is a way, way better song. It's a way better instrumental that I wish they had included instead of The Brazilian. If you go and listen to Do the Neurotic by Genesis online, it's more of a traditional sounding Genesis song, and that's the reason why they left it off, because they felt like it sounded too traditional and they wanted to, step outside of the box. The next album, We Cant Dance, now Genesis is starting to get into their kind of autumn years. I'm going to put that in the B squad. We Can't Dance had some good songs on it, but it also sounded kind of sleepy to me. I did a whole video breakdown of this album on my channel, but if you look at the tracks here, No Son of Mine is one of my favorite pop Phil Collins era Genesis songs for sure. Very, just kind of a cool minor key song, very heartfelt lyrics, or they're sung heartfelt at least. The next song, Jesus He Knows Me, it's a fun track. I really do like the music a lot. Then you get into their attempt at a long song again with Driving the Last Spike. I said this before, but I don't like that song. It sounds very sleepy and tired for a Genesis song. It sounds like an old man laying down for a nap. It sounds like a band that knows that this is their last album together. I Can't Dance is a fun song. I really like the weird the fake percussive sounds that Tony Banks is using on his keyboard. That was kind of a new feature back then, so it was kind of cool to see that. I'm not going to get into every single one of these songs, but basically just, the album felt a little sleepy compared to their other efforts. And then we get to the final album, Calling All Stations. That's a D. That album's awful. I don't blame any particular person, okay? This is what happens when you lose if you have a trifecta of creative people and you lose one of them, and so you only have 2 left, and one of the people out of the 2 takes over, and too much of their will is done. You get Calling All Stations. This was a Tony Banks solo album. They recruited Ray Wilson from this obscure Irish band called Stiltskin, and they had him take Phil's spot on vocals, and they got some other session guy in on drums. This album is just terrible. There's no immediacy to it. There's nothing that grabs you about this album. Even the intro, the first song is 5 minutes and 43 seconds long. That would have been fine back in 1975 when people put on records and sat in their beanbag chairs and smoked a doober. But in 1997 when this album came out, it just was not it was tone deaf, but not lyrically like it was offensive or anything, but just the musical direction was tone deaf. There wasn't really any single, material on here. I mean, at this point, you're competing with guys like Radiohead and grunge, and, it's just Genesis were beyond dinosaurs at this point. A lot changed from 1991 when We Cant Dance came out compared to, when 1997 when Calling All Stations came out. 8 years, a lot can change, man, in the musical zeitgeist. So you had Calling All Stations, which is a lackluster song. It takes it about at least 3 minutes of the song for it to get to any kind of exciting, portion of it. Congo is an okay song, but it's just kind of like, okay, you're singing about the Congo, whatever. Shipwrecked is an awful song. Alien Afternoon is weird, but not in a good way. Not About Us is not a good song. If That's What You Need is not a good song. The Dividing Line is it's got a pretty cool intro. The synth kind of thing that Tony Banks does. It's got kind of a cool synth middle part, but all this music on this album, there's nothing that you get excited about. I remember when Genesis started touring for this album, and they pretty much only played songs off this album, and I remember thinking, like, if Genesis came to my town and they were only playing this album, and it was 2 of the 5 original members of Genesis, totally different singer, I don't think I'd go. I think I'd stay home. It's just not a good album. It's very bland. There's no immediacy. Phil Collins brought all the immediacy. Tony Banks brought all the stuff that got stuck in your head 2 weeks down the road. 2 weeks down the road, this tune would pop in your head out of nowhere, and you're like, well, how'd that get there? That was Tony Banks' stuff. And then Mike was in between with his guitar and his bass additions, but you really needed that Phil Collins touch for the formula to keep going as it was. So that is my rankings of all the Genesis albums. I'm looking at this now, and I'm pretty satisfied with it. If you're a fan of Genesis, or if you want to see me do this for any other band, let me know. I'll be happy to do this. This was pretty fun, and didn't take forever for me to set up. So I hope you guys enjoyed watching, and have a good rest of your night.